Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I hope you're all safe and well. From what I can see from my share screen, that's the case. I cannot see everybody at the same time, but I hope that everybody's well. As you might have seen or heard, Russia has recently held a 7-day national plebiscite from June 25th to July 1st, intended to keep President Putin in power for 2 more 6-year terms. That is until at least 2036. The official outcome of this popular consultation, with a turnout rate of about 67%, went as expected, with 3/4 of the voters giving their endorsement to a constitutional amendment. A constitutional amendment was needed because Putin has been through 2 consecutive 6-term mandates. So in other words, has been president for 12 years. And normally the constitution would not have allowed him to run for a 3rd term. So an amendment was necessary. This amendment, which by the way was had already been ratified by the Russian parliament and regional legislatures across the country. So this recent development actually gives us today the opportunity, as I mentioned last week, to briefly take a look at Russia's internal situation today in 2020. But before we do that, I'd like to bring you up to date on a couple of developments that took place since our last class, last Monday, having to do with China. China, whose aggressive conduct in foreign policy has been a subject of serious concern, as we have seen last week, not only to some of its immediate neighbors, such as India, that we really went into details last week, but also to the United States and its allies that are watching with growing anxiety Beijing expanding influence to other regions of the world. The first development is Secretary Pompeo's statement of last Monday that China's expansive maritime claims across most of the South China Sea were completely unlawful, rejecting any Chinese claim to some of the tiny atolls and rocks artificially built up by China since around 2014 into larger outposts covered with airstrips and military facilities. Michel, if you don't mind putting up the first China map for everybody to see. Thank you, Michel. You can see on this map, for instance, the Mischief Reefs in the middle of the China Sea, and the second Thomas Shoal. These reefs fall under the territorial jurisdiction of the Philippines that you can also see on the map, as well as James Shoal, which are not indicated on the map, but which are very close to Malaysia, about 50 nautical miles from Malaysia. Now, as a reminder, China delineates its claim to the South China Sea with what it calls a 9-dashed line that you can also see on this map in red, a boundary that includes, this is the area the size of Mexico, and demarcates almost the entire region. Now, Pompeo's announcement has been the strongest and most explicit supporters yet by Washington of a ruling in 2016 by an international tribunal at the Hague Court in the Netherlands, that China had violated international law with its action in the South China Sea. A ruling that China has rejected, actually, and it leaves open, this announcement also leaves open the possibility that the United States might come to the defense of nations like Vietnam. You see all these countries on the map: Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines. If clashes erupt between China and its immediate neighbors. Washington has been asserting its military presence in the South China Sea now for a long time. Since actually the Obama administration, and during the Obama administration, the US Navy conducted what it calls freedom of navigation operations across this area to challenge Chinese claims to the waters. In recent months, however, the US has pushed back in other ways as well, sending recently 2 warships into waters near Malaysia as a show of force against Chinese government ships. Now, South China Sea's seabed supposedly contains vast reserve of oil and gas, and the waters are among the richest in the region in terms of fishing. So government very often sign contracts with private companies that do exploration and drilling in the area. Lately, however, the growing Chinese naval presence and the multiplication of the acts of harassment by the Chinese military have led the neighboring countries to downsize to some extent their commercial activities in this area, where they could previously operate freely. But the biggest concern is that by intimidating its neighbors, China is slowly taking control over the navigation lanes in the South China Sea, which are of tremendous strategic importance, as 1/3 of the world's shipping passes through these lanes, carrying over $3 trillion in trade every year. The official Chinese reaction to Pompeo's statement came almost immediately, with Beijing accusing the US government of, and I quote, exaggerating the situation in the region and attempting to sow discord between China and other littoral countries. The biggest question today is what the United States intends to do or can do about the Chinese military buildup in that area and other parts of the vast sea claimed by Beijing. Could Secretary Pompeo's statement presage a larger US naval presence in the region, as well as other actions, such as the imposition of new sanctions against companies that do business with China in what are now, according to the US administration anyway, illegally occupied waters? That's the first development. And we have to see how things are going to unfold. But with a multiplication of these harassment acts by the Chinese and the increased presence of the military of the US Navy in those areas, obviously increase also the risk of confrontation between the two powers. The second development has been the recent draft agreement reached without much publicity, I must say, by China and Iran, creating a potential bilateral economic and security partnership. I say potential because the text of the deal has not been submitted yet to the Iranian parliament for approval, nor made public for that matter. That being said, the agreement reached by the two parties would vastly expand Chinese presence in Iran in areas such as banking, telecommunications, ports, railways, and dozen other activities, such as military cooperation, for instance. In exchange for Beijing receiving regular and probably heavily discounted supply of Iranian oil over the next 25 years. Well, such a deal would not only give China a foothold in a region that has been a strategic preoccupation of the United States for decades, but also undercut the Trump administration's efforts to isolate the Iranian government because of its nuclear and military ambitions. According to the terms of the deal, China would finance about 100 projects representing some $400 billion over the next 25 years. Also, and more importantly, such a deal, if formalized, would indicate that unless most countries, China has no intention to comply with the sanction regime on Tehran imposed by the United States, feeling powerful and confident enough to withstand American penalties and sanctions that would inevitably follow. as it has in the trade dispute between the Trump administration and Beijing. As for Iran, which up to now has always looked towards Europe for trade and investment partners after the US abandoned the nuclear deal, China's involvement would represent obviously a lifeline, allowing Iran to get out from under the US sanctions that have suffocated its economy and discouraged badly needed foreign investment there. Of particular strategic concern for Washington is the planned expansion by the Chinese of the Iranian port of Jask. Michelle, if you don't mind putting up map number 2. Here we are. Thank you, Michelle. You can see on the map, and you can see on your map also that was emailed to you if you received it, the port of Jask. Now, the port of Jask happens to be just outside of the strait. You see the Strait of Hormuz right here. You can see on one side Dubai, on the other side Iran. That's the Strait of Hormuz is. At the entrance to the Persian Gulf. That would give the Chinese not only a strategic vantage point on the waters through most of the world's oil transits, but also an ideal location to keep an eye on the US Navy's Fifth Fleet, which is headquartered in Bahrain. You can see Bahrain next to Qatar on the other side of the Persian Gulf, just across Iran. So you can see how close Jask is from Bahrain, which is really next door to the entrance to the Gulf of Hormuz. The proposed partnership has, however, stoked a fierce debate within Iran, where critics across the political spectrum have raised concerns that the Iranian government is secretly what they are selling off the country to China in a moment of economic weakness and international isolation. Particularly in a speech in late June, one of Iran's former presidents, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, called it a suspicious secret, called the deal a suspicious secret that the people of Iran would never approve. That being said, the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, apparently did sign on that deal. So this is where we stand today, with prospects of rapidly deteriorating US-Chinese relations, a very distinct possibility. As you can tell, the Chinese efforts far from home in the Persian Gulf, and also closer to home in the South China Sea. The similarity are striking. Now, these are the couple of developments I wanted to bring to your attention that happened over the past few days. Now, going back to Russia, let me first say that few nations elicit such contradictory reactions about American political experts as Vladimir Putin's Russia. For some, Russia is an irredeemable pariah state, responsive only to harsh punishment and containment, while others see a wronged and resurgent great power that deserves more accommodation. Across the board, however, resignation has set in about the state of US-Russian relations, and the American diplomacy seems to have lost confidence in its own capacity to change the game. But today's Russia is neither monolithic nor immutable. Inside the country, low oil prices, the coronavirus pandemic, and Russia's growing sense of malaise all bring new costs and risks for the Kremlin. Abroad, Putin has played a weak hand well because the US and its allies have let him, allowing Russia to violate arms control treaties, international law, the sovereignty of its neighbors, and the integrity of elections in the US and Europe. But to have a better understanding of what's going on today in Russia, let's take a step back to the start of the century. When Putin assumed the presidency in 2000, he set two goals to justify his policies and consolidate his power. Internally, he pledged to restore order after years of chaos and impoverishment during the 1990s. His pledge was welcomed by the United States and its Western allies that hoped that by putting an end to the oligarchic excesses, to the ruble crashes, to the dependency on foreign bailouts, and general lawlessness that ruled in Russia, Putin would make Russia more predictable and more reliable as an international partner. And even when it became obvious that Putin's methods for reestablishing control were increasingly Soviet-like, such as closing down opposition newspapers and TV stations, jailing, exiling, and even killing political and economic rivals, and re-establishing single-party dominance in the parliament and regional governments, the West preferred to give Putin the benefit of the doubt and looked the other way. Also, the George W. Bush administration, preoccupied with terrorism after the 9/11 attacks, believed that Moscow's internal affairs were its own business. All the more so that Putin's ambitions of political stability and economic development in the country resonated well with most Russians, who over the next 2 decades would steadily relinquish more and more of their rights, such as freedom of expression and assembly, political pluralism, judicial fairness, and an open economy in the name of stability, of a strong state, and in the name of middle-class prosperity. Externally, most Russians also embraced Putin's promise to restore Russia's greatness, following the humiliating loss of territory, of global influence and military dominance that had come with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. And for a time, that worked, as Russia's conquest in Ukraine and Syria were widely popular at home and deflected attention, if you will, from its internal problems. Encouraged by his initial success, Putin's geopolitical appetite grew, and he came to believe that democratic states in the West were weak and Russia could corrode their political systems from inside. In order to achieve the two goals that I mentioned, internally and externally, internal order and external power, Putin developed a two-pronged strategy. The first one was rebuilding the military, the Russian military, including and regaining Russia's global status as a leading power, including reestablishing its preeminence in what it considers to be its own backyard, namely the ex-communist states in Eastern Europe. The rebuilding of Russia's military went smoothly, as Washington paid very little attention to Moscow's substantial military investment. Considering Russia, after the implosion of the Soviet Union, as a second-rate military power. President Bush's administration hardly consulted with Moscow in 2001 when the US withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty in order to be able to build bigger missile defenses against rogue states like Iran and North Korea. Years later, Putin used this American withdrawal to violate the terms of two other pillars of the 1980s arms control architecture, namely the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, accusing Washington of having broken Moscow trust first. Also taking lessons from the US experience in Afghanistan and Iraq, and from Russia's own subpar performance in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and also in its 2008 war in Georgia, Putin invested heavily into irregular warfare, cyber capacities, long-range conventional weapons, and hypersonic missiles. Washington and its allies would not wake up to the impact of these military investments until Russia seized Crimea in 2014. If the rebuilding of the Russian military was met with a great degree of indifference in Washington, Putin's second priority, regaining status as a major player in international affairs on the international scene, was definitely boosted by the United States and its allies. Washington brought Moscow into the World Trade Organization and created the G8 and the NATO-Russia Council, and made sure to take important decisions, such as whether to launch the US-led war in Afghanistan in 2001, and whether to intervene in Libya in 2011, brought these decisions to the UN Security Council and to the G8 for debate, so that Russia can be included in the discussion. Once again, the belief was that Russia, like China, would become a more responsible stakeholder, if you will, in global affairs by being integrated into rules-based international institutions. It is only when Putin, emboldened by his popularity at home and the support that he received abroad, started imposing his views on his immediate neighborhood, that the US and its Eastern allies started pushing back. Putin strongly believed, and he still does today, that a belt of increasingly democratic, prosperous countries around Russia would pose a direct challenge to his leadership model and risk recontaminating his own people with democratic aspirations. Michel, if you don't mind to put up the third and final map, please. Okay, this is the revised one, Michel, that I sent to you. I don't believe so.
Do you want the other one?
Yes, please.
Okay, hold on.
While you're waiting, Lawrence, is the echo gone, or you still get some echo in your?
Echo is gone. I signed off and back on.
Okay, all right. This one, thank you, Michel. You can tell I drew a border, more or less, from the Baltic Sea up north, down to the Black Sea, south. And for Putin, all these countries placed west of Russia's borders, basically what are Russia's borders, represent, in a way, a belt of security and represents also, obviously, what he believes to be his own backyard. Well, obviously, you see Belarusia, you see Ukraine, in the area of Donetsk and Kharkov. These are places which are in the Ukraine, and some of them are occupied by Russian irregular troops today. Going down to the Black Sea, I wrote down here Crimea. Simferopol is part of Crimea, and Kerch is a peninsula on the Russian side that connects Russia's mainland to Crimea today. And then it goes up all the way to the border with Finland. Now, you also have this special entity, Kaliningrad, which is in the separates or at the border between Poland and Germany, which is also Russian today. So for Putin, if Russia could not reclaim those lands, it had once dominated the Soviet Union. I'm talking about the Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. If obviously they became independent after the Soviet Union broke up. So if Russia cannot reclaim those lands, that's difficult to do, even for Putin. The next best thing, in his opinion, would be the creation of a zone of non-alignment stretching from all the way from the Baltic in the north to the Black Sea in the south. This zone of non-alignment for Putin would guarantee to keep Russia strategically and politically safe. Now, this Putin's perception clashed with the efforts by successive US governments to prevent the Russian leader from reestablishing, actually, a Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And what did the US offer these countries in particular? Obviously, it offers them to extend NATO membership to all of these new democracies created after they became independent from the Soviet Union, which had worked for years, it must be said, to meet the alliance's rigorous admission standards. Now, to assuage the Kremlin at the same time, Washington and its ally tried very hard to persuade Moscow that NATO was a purely defensive alliance and it posed no threat to Russia. But despite all these assurances, Putin wouldn't have it. And he fought back. Russia, as you know, seized Crimea and much of the Donbass, again, in the Donetsk and Kharkiv areas, you can see, which are on the Ukrainian side, but for all intents and purposes, occupied by Russian irregular troops and its local allies, militia, Ukrainian militia, pro-Russian, and propped up despots in Libya, in Syria, and Venezuela. It has used cyber weapons against foreign bank and government systems, interfered in foreign democratic elections, and assassinated or attempted to assassinate its enemies on European soil. All that without any notable consequences. Meanwhile, it did not help that the US established red lines that it never reinforced, like in Syria, openly questioned its commitment to NATO, strained its alliances with tariffs and recriminations, and created divisions with its allies, allowing Russia to counter any joint and coherent strategy. More importantly, the US and its allies have lost focus over time on the one thing that should worry the Russian president, which is the mood inside Russia. After 20 years of failing to invest in Russia's modernization. Last year, Russia's GDP growth was an anemic 1.3%. This year, the coronavirus pandemic and the free fall in oil prices are expected to result in a significant okay, I think it's over. This year, as I said, the coronavirus pandemic and the free fall in oil prices are expected to result in a significant contraction, economic contraction. And international sanctions deter serious foreign investment in Russia from most countries. In addition, Putin's insistence on tight state control of key sectors of the economy has suppressed innovation and diversification. Russia's roads, rails, schools, and hospitals are crumbling, and Russians' purchasing power continues to shrink. In polls conducted in the country last year, a staggering 53% of 18 to 24-year-olds said they wanted to emigrate, the highest number since the 1990s. The air of resignation and cynicism inside Russia today is reminiscent of past eras after Kremlin leaders focused too much on adventures abroad and too little on their people welfare at home, like during the Brezhnev era, for instance. The difference, notable difference, is that Putin still has money to throw around. As Russia's two financial crises in the 1990s and the need to keep his inner circle happy prompted him to maintain a large rainy day fund. For instance, Russia currently has $150 billion in its national wealth fund and more than $550 billion overall in gold and foreign reserves. Now, it remains to be seen how much of this money Putin is willing to spend to support Russia's health system and the country's economic recovery from the coronavirus. And more importantly, it remains to be seen how patient Russians may prove to be this time around if the pandemic hits the country hard. So, in this geopolitical context, how could the United States and its allies best counter Putin's ambitions? First, by remembering that Putin's recent forays in the Ukraine and Syria have occurred, as I said earlier, mainly because Washington and its allies have let him. So depicting Putin today as a peer or an invincible, or Russia as an invincible enemy could be further from the truth. The reality is that Russia today pales in comparison to the Soviet adversary. The US and its allies should return to the statecraft that won the Cold War and continue to yield good results for many years after, which is a combination of military might, economic incentives, and direct communication with the Russian people. The first, the military power, obviously would require maintaining robust military budgets, modernizing US and allies' nuclear weapon system, deploying new conventional missiles and missile defenses, and improving in area where Russia has gained the upper hand in the past few years, which is hypersonic missile and cyber security. The one lesson Putin seems to have learned from the Cold War is that President Reagan successfully bankrupted the Soviet Union by forcing a nuclear arms race on it. While Putin would not want Russia, obviously, to suffer the same fate today, he also realizes, and he's very aware of the fact that Russia is in no position to engage in an arms race with the United States. The second one, the economic incentives, should take into account what the Russian president really wants out of the US-Russian relationship, which is the lifting of sanctions. And Washington should offer him incentives to cooperate in the form of removal of tariffs and regulatory barriers in exchange of better relations. And finally, by communicating directly with the Russian people. In the Soviet era, the US defeated the Kremlin's censorship by disseminating its messages through Voice of America and Radio Free Europe broadcast and regular contacts with dissidents. Despite Putin's best efforts, today's Russia is more permeable to outside influence than at the end of the last century, as young Russians are far more likely to consume information and news via the internet than through state-sponsored television or print media. Although no one would expect this group to rise up and demand change anytime soon, there is no reason for the US to let Putin remain the primary shaper of young Russians' understanding of democratic policies and values. Now, the big question is, would that carrot and stick policy work effectively with Russia? Nobody knows, as it is possible that Putin's sense of security is by now so tightly tied to the Kremlin's control of the economy that American and European offers of free trade and investment would not interest him. it could also be that Putin might fear that opening the door to better economic relations with the West would make him look weak and needy in the eyes of his own people. But that should not, however, prevent the US administration, irrespective of who will be the tenant in the Oval Office in November, to seize the moment of renewal at home and stagnation in Russia to provide the Kremlin with an alternative to its growing dependence on China. Putin may not want or might not be able to take this offer, but the Russian people should know that the US and its allies are giving him and Russia a choice. So this is where we stand today on the Russia's internal situation and the US-Russian relationship. So I open the floor to discussion. Again, since we're meeting under sort of exceptional circumstances, your question could be connected to our subject of today, or about anything else that you might have seen in the news or is of concern to you in any parts of the world. All right, I'm waiting for your questions. Emily, how bad COVID-19 in Russia? Again, it's very difficult. There are a number of countries whose official numbers are not very reliable, to put it diplomatically. So I don't know how bad the virus has hit, how badly it hit Russia, but apparently, according to reports coming out of the country, unofficial ones, apparently seems to be spreading a lot over there. And probably we'll never know the truth. Officially, there were very few, not really, but fewer cases than in the West. But that has never been confirmed by other than the official sources in Moscow. So they are not very reliable, to say the least. From Peggy, how strong is the competition between Russia and China to dominate Europe and Eurasia? The competition seems to be not so much in Europe so far, although, as you could tell, China is getting closer and closer to Europe, and as a matter of fact, has already started making very heavy investments, particularly in Italy and Malta. So their presence is expanding in Europe. But for the time being, the main area of competition between the two is in Central Asia, in the former Soviet republics of Asia, where obviously Russia would love to maintain its political influence because most of the leaders in those countries go back to the Soviet Union, or at least are people who are relatively close to Putin. And China, with this project of Belt and Road Initiative, is prepared to make huge investments in those countries to get them under its influence. So far, I don't think that the Chinese have been very successful, because Russia is monitoring very closely the Chinese efforts, but Russia does not have the money to compete with China in those countries. And as a matter of fact, up to now, the official line in Beijing was that Russia is part of the Belt and Road Initiative and participate actively in it, which is not so. As a matter of fact, in the past year, the Russian authorities have submitted to the Chinese about 100 projects that they had in Russia, for which they have no money. And they called for Chinese companies to invest and to achieve, so to work on those projects in Russia. But every one of them was turned down by the Chinese. So I don't know to what extent Russia, and there was recently, it can evidence very well, recently there was a meeting of the members of the Belt and Road Initiative in Beijing, and of foreign ministers of all these countries, which to some extent participate in that initiative, the Chinese initiative. And what was notable is that Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was not there. Russia sent a low-ranking civil servant from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but the foreign minister was not there. So Russia's participation in this initiative doesn't seem to be very active, if at all. Mark, why at this time is China stirring things up? What has changed? Well, I would say that one of the reasons, again, it's very difficult to say why they are stirring things up in Iran. And in Iran, actually, they're looking after their own interests. And obviously, China would love to have a foothold in the Middle East, where it was never present. And also to have a voice in what's going on in the Middle East, obviously. But in a way, I think the leadership has decided that it would like to deflect attention from the virus and for the role China played in the spreading of the virus, in the mishandling by the Chinese leadership of the virus, drawing the attention to other areas. And also, South China Sea is not something new. They've been building up that area for a while now, for the past 10, 15 years. Now, probably they reinforce that move. I guess basically it has to do with deflecting the attention of the public opinion at home, as well as, and also at home, drumming up the nationalist issue, which the Chinese have done every time that they were attacked from the outside, to show that China is trying to defend itself against outside bad influences like the United States. And again, as I said, for the Chinese, the mere presence of the United States off its coast is an anomaly that should be corrected sooner or later. But for the time being, I think, again, is to deflect attention from that's what I see as a main reason, from the mishandling of the pandemic. From Steel, I just read that Britain suspended an extradition treaty with Hong Kong. How will that affect things with China? Well, Britain has done a couple of things in the past week. It has banned Huawei from installing, actually, the Johnson government first gave permission to Huawei to start working on its 5G system in the UK, and that decision was rescinded by Johnson last week. This is number one. And number two, obviously, suspending an extradition treaty comes after Johnson's promise 2 weeks ago that if this new security law by the Chinese were to be effectively implemented, then the UK would open its borders to 3 million, there are about 6 million Hong Kong residents, to about 3 million Hong Kong residents to come to the UK. So that's another decision made by the Conservative government in the UK. Obviously, it won't make things better with China. And China will probably take some countermeasures against the UK. It remains to be seen what and how. But this decision and the announcement by the UK will not improve the relationship with China, that's for sure. From Mark, why doesn't Russia want to open up to the West like China to prosper their weak economy? Well, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, I think that Putin is afraid that he fears that the opening to the West altogether might change Russia altogether, might call into question the power that he holds altogether. If democracy were allowed to prosper in Russia. So when he has to balance his political power and his inner circle's political power and the economic prosperity, well, he would rather take his political power for the time being and try to deal with the economic situation as well as he can. Obviously, he's not doing very well in that area so far. So we'll see. It will remain to be seen what can be done. But again, as I mentioned many times, the West holds a part of responsibility in Russia's reaction today, because after the Soviet Union imploded, and despite the admission of Russia among the G7, the attitude of Europe and of the United States, particularly of the United States, was very condescending towards the Russians, considering that the Cold War was over, there was only one superpower now, and that the Russians now do not have the military power, nor the military might, and nor the economic power to rival with the United States. So in a way, you can throw Russia a bone here and there, but the overall attitude to Russia was very condescending, overlooking the fact that they had their own pride and they had been a superpower. So when Putin came and offered Russians regaining their status to some extent, the Russians were ready for everything, including giving up a number of rights that they acquired under Gorbachev, the first years after communism. And obviously Putin, former KGB officer, took advantage of that. So here we are today. Russia is still not a leading power. It is a power, but it's a nuclear power, but it's not the power that China is. And it doesn't threaten the United States. That's true also to the extent where China does. That being said, it asserts its power, and its power mostly of annoying the Americans, not so much of countering the United States, really, but just annoying the United States whenever the opportunity is there. Deborah, I thought I just read that there was the largest protest ever against Putin in Russia. Are these people in danger? Their leaders probably are, because some of them have been going to jail, obviously, or they have to sign statements to the effect that they're not going to participate any longer in demonstrations against Putin's regime. As I said, Russia, just as China, has this policy of you can get rich or you can accumulate wealth any way you want to in Russia today, and that is true, as long as you don't get involved in politics. Or if you get involved in politics, you're on Putin's side and not against him. If you become too powerful, then you have a problem. But as long as you keep apolitical, so to speak, and you don't get involved in activities which are perceived to go to harm Putin's regime, you can do more or less whatever you want, including outside the law. Shelley, this is Shelley. Hi, Jim. Have you any thoughts regarding the start of the Ethiopian dam and its impact of Egyptian relations? Thank you. Well, you take us far from Russia and China also. Yeah, well, obviously there is a huge issue between Ethiopia and Egypt for the Nile waters. It goes without saying that such a dam, according to the Egyptians, would deprive Egypt from the water it gets from the Nile, and thus would jeopardize the fertility of the areas where the Nile runs. So there is an issue there. Now, it remains to be seen when and how this Ethiopian or the dam on the Ethiopian side will be finished. This is not the case, I understand. So it's a very fluid situation, and I think that negotiations are still ongoing between the parties. Mark, no Trump administration backed away from excluding foreign college students. Indeed, it did. So that's a decision that I don't know if the legal actions brought by a number of universities against the administration played a role, to some extent maybe, or Trump's advisors succeeded in making him reverse his decision, but indeed foreign college students will be allowed to stay in the United States, including those whose classes will be online, like ours, starting in September. From Emily, Russia reportedly has a fourth legal amount of COVID-19, according to Johns Hopkins COVID report, with 776,000. If Russia is undercounting, then the number might be as high as USA with its economic. I think it, again, based on the previous experience with the Russian official numbers, again, I don't know where Johns Hopkins report comes from, obviously from Russia, but I don't know how they gathered, how they came to that number of 770,000 for a population of about 150 million, which is less than a half of the US population. But what I do believe is that the number is unreliable. And we will never really know the real number of people infected. From Tom, the Russian military is certainly a peculiar institution. They have with the T-14 Armada main battle tank and the T-15 Armada infantry fighting vehicles, two of the most advanced armored vehicles. Bravo, Tom, you're a military expert. But that cannot move beyond the prototype stage because lack of the funds to actually mass produce these units. The Russian fleet is also a shambles, indeed, since they cannot afford the most basic maintenance and upkeep for their ships, leading to constant breakdowns and deadly explosions. Indeed, you very well illustrate what I was saying up to now. There is no money. And again, considering its military situation, Russia is no match for the United States and cannot afford any type of race, military race, with the United States. So this is one area probably that the US and the European Western countries, when you come to think of it, even the Western European countries under the umbrella of NATO have a more modern, if you will, army than Russia, not even including the United States. But again, Russia has kept this reputation from the Soviet Union of being a superpower, which is not. It got back some status, that's true. It's part of most international decisions, that is true. But again, it does not make decisions. It reacts, it doesn't act, actually. It reacts to, let's say, whatever decision the United States would like to take internationally. It reacts to it by trying to prevent it or trying to annoy the US administration in any way possible. But it's not the leading superpower of the 70s and 80s that people still imagine. It's a regional power, and it's no longer a superpower. It's a regional power with a nuclear bomb, that's for sure. But it's not the military power that it was once. Anything else? Anything else once? Anything else twice? Boy, I must have been very clear. There are no questions anymore. Or we run out of subjects for today. Either way. I think there are no, I spoke too fast. From Mark. How do you explain 50% of folks say they won't get vaccinated? Oh, sorry. I missed Tom's comment. The Russians certainly have quite the history of election meddling in Western democracies. They have tried to upend elections in Ukraine, the Baltic states, Finland, Poland, Hungary, Denmark, the Netherlands, Finland, and France. And don't forget the Balkan states in Montenegro, Macedonia, and I think in Croatia also. Via Pierre's old paramount, Marine Le Pen, really. It's news to me, but they had success, though, in the United States and Great Britain with Brexit and the daily Trump shenanigans. Well, in the UK, he had success. Well, I don't know if you can call that a success for Trump. Yes, the end result was definitely a success because Trump has been very clear from the beginning that he would like the UK get out of the European Union. To what extent his position influenced the UK, the British voter, to vote against the Labour Party, I don't know. I don't believe that you give him too much importance on the impact of the decision in the UK. I think the UK voters mostly voted against the Labour Party and its leader rather than to please Trump. And also, let's not forget that a US president who really got involved in the UK elections was Obama, who was in London just the year before the end of his second term, and very publicly and openly urged, actually he did it twice. He did it before the British referendum and before the British referendum. He went to England and publicly and openly urged the British voters to vote to remain in the European Union. That was no secret. So in that respect, you can call Obama's meddling, because that's what the UK papers called it, an interference precedent. So I don't know if Trump can, the end result was a success for success. That remains to be seen to what extent, but yes, this is a type of outcome Trump advocated. But to say that he impacted the UK election, maybe this is, or Brexit, I don't really, I doubt it. As for Marie Le Pen, yes, Marie Le Pen, actually, what is not known is that Marie Le Pen did come to the United States after Trump's election, but before, when he became president-elect, before he took office in Washington in January 17. But what is less known is that she never got an appointment with him personally. She never met him personally. She met with some of his collaborators or assistants, but not with Trump particularly. And I haven't seen too many articles or too many statements by Trump in support of the National Front at the time, or Marine Le Pen. So I don't know to what extent the French were, as a matter of fact, any support from Trump would negatively impact the French voters. So I don't believe that he supported particularly the National Front in France. Mark, how do you explain 50% of folks say they won't get vaccinated? I don't know if I have an explanation for that, except that they believe that they have the right to express and to do whatever they decide, and it's not for the administration to tell them what to do, even though it has been proven, it seems to me, that vaccination campaigns were a good thing. But how can you explain that so many people refuse to wear a mask also? I don't want to start a debate on that, but when it seems to, it shows that wearing a mask prevents the virus from spreading, how many people say, no, I want to wear one? I have no explanation for that, except that, again, they believe ultimately that the personal decision is more important than anything that is imposed from top down, from the government. From Mark, against coronavirus, not trusting the safety and confidence of FDA, CDC. I have no comment. I don't know. I don't know. The only thing that I know, Mark, is that every so-called expert who come on television or anywhere on radio or in the press, which is true not only in this country, but all over the place, in Europe, here and everywhere, have contradictory opinions or different opinions on the virus. The truth is that for now, nobody really knows. And as long as we have not come up with a universal cure, whether it's a vaccine, whether it's a treatment for everybody, the truth is that nobody really knows what's going on. Numbers fluctuate, go up and down. Again, for the mask, for instance, we were told in the beginning there was no need. It was counterproductive back in March and April. That was basically the Chinese position at the time, that the virus cannot spread in the air, and so on. And then we came back to making the mask mandatory and asking people to present, like in France, a permission, official paper to go out 500 feet from home and come back and just run errands and come. So a strict lockdown to now reopening things in France also, including indoor restaurants, with the numbers going up. They just experimenting the governments everywhere. Again, not in the United States only. Here it's even more complicated because it's a federal entity where you have a government, federal government, and then you have states, which are relatively independent of the government, so they can implement their own rules. But even in countries which are centralized, like France or Italy, they don't know. They just make a decision, they stick to it, and if they see that it doesn't work out, they just come back and impose again lockdowns, and so nobody knows. It's a fluctuating situation, which again will be resolved only the day, satisfactorily, I mean, only the day when we have a universal response to this. Emily, what are the long-term effects of a vaccine that is being rushed through? No one knows. As one who has violent reaction to tested vaccines, I would be reluctant. All right, point taken. I don't know what are the long-term effects. For the time being, Emily, they could not find even the short-term effects of the vaccine in terms of positive effects, so let alone the long-time effects. Obviously, it will need a lot of tests, and it will need a lot of tests over a long period of time to really know what are the long-time effects of it. So, and definitely all these laboratories are trying to come up first with the vaccine for financial reasons. Now, how efficient that will be and how harmless such a vaccine will be, even if I were a doctor, medical doctor, I wouldn't know, but I'm not. So I cannot give my opinion. I realize that if you have violent reactions to vaccine, generally speaking, you're more than reluctant to try something like that. What you can hope that if you do not get the vaccine because you have reactions to it, the vaccine will prove to be efficient. So people surrounding you will all get vaccinated. They all get vaccinated, so you won't get you won't get the virus. But that's the only thing I can sell. It's not very clever. Tom, I refer to Putin's influence on Brexit, not Trump's, for much of the funding for pro-Brexit effort was actually funded covertly by Russia. Le Pen was also largely funded by, yes. Le Pen was, not Le Pen, but the National Front was funded, I don't know how largely, but was in part funded by Russia indeed. Davida, how truly badly will Russian interference in US election affect the outcome? Thank you. That's a very good question. This is something that will never be answered to everybody's satisfaction. People who believe that Clinton lost the elections because of this interference, we always tell you that it was a major factor of Clinton losing the elections. People who do not believe that Clinton lost the elections because of the Russian interference, and they believe that she lost the elections because of the likability issue, particularly, and because they wanted to try something new with a different approach to the political life, will tell you that it has no effect whatsoever on the American voters. So this is a debate between the pro and the anti, which will go on forever with no satisfactory answer. I don't know, and nobody does really. From Tom, huge Russian disinformation efforts on the internet also supported Brexit, Le Pen, and the Russian efforts to sabotage other Western democracies. I don't know, but it's a possibility too. The only thing I know about the other democracies is that when last year asked about the Italian elections at the time and whether Russia got involved again in a disinformation campaign in Italy, he smiled and said, well, I don't need to because the Italians like me anyway, so they'll vote for my candidate, which was Salvini at the time, whose party won the election at the time. So he said, there is no need for me to get involved in Italy. It's one of the very few countries. He said it with a smile, so nobody knows it was a joke or a serious joke. Said, this is one elections where I don't need to get involved because the Italians like me and they'll vote anyway for our candidate whom we support, who is Salvini. And he did win the election, so. Mark, do European countries have large-scale mail-in voting? To my knowledge, no. First of all, remember that the populations, we're talking about small countries in Europe, most of them. And generally speaking, they vote physically. The habit of voting by mail is not very popular in Europe. So to my knowledge, no. Here it is organized because obviously the country is huge and there are states and it's a different organization. In Europe, it's more centralized. So the male vote is less common. All right, so seems to me this was the last question for today. Well, thank you for those who are still on. And again, I wish you a very safe week, and I'll see you next Monday. I don't know exactly on what subject we'll be looking at next Monday, but well, we'll find something. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Norma. See you all next week.